Assalamu alaikum, peace be with you. Welcome to episode 2 of World in Motion, the Dawa-centric podcast with me, Brother Daniel Johnson. I've got another amazing guest today. He's called Mike Gilbert. He's very much a political animal, and he's from Lincolnshire, land of sausages. And we're going to chat to him just now, and I'm sure he's got a lot of interesting things to say. Mike, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much indeed. I'm pleased to be here.
Mike Gilbert, you're from the Blue Revolution. Please tell us a bit about the Blue Revolution and a bit about yourself, if you don't mind.
Well, the Blue Revolution is just a political brand, really. It doesn't actually have in it of itself any particular policy position on anything. It's just an opportunity for individuals who want to stand as independents in local and national elections to identify themselves with our brand and to identify themselves with our values, which are very much about freedom of speech, freedom of opportunity, contract, choice and consent. So the party itself just consists of really a labelling exercise. You apply to be a candidate using our brand. As long as we're happy that you're committed to democracy and freedom of speech, we'll endorse your candidacy and off you go. You pay for your own campaign, you run your own campaign. If you're successful, that's great. You can continue to use the brand label Blue Revolution. Or you can choose just to identify yourself as independent or whatever else you want to identify yourself with. It's very flexible. The idea is it gives support to people who are interested in getting involved in politics, don't really see the value of going as an independent without any real support and backup, but so want to retain that level of independence that you lose when you join a mainstream political party.
The name Blue Revolution, Mike, it conjures up images in my mind of Phyllis Sugden from Coronation Street and her blue rinse hairdo. I assumed you were a party for old folks, but that's not the case, is it?
Well, it's a party for anybody really who's interested in retaining their independence in politics, not being whipped by their political party. Yeah, I mean it's available for young people, people of any age, any particular background. The word blue, is not linked to the Conservative Party in any way, means or form. Blue stands for blue sky, blue planet, blue collar. The word blue has connotations with a lot of positive things.
Yeah.
And I wanted really, when I started the group in 2017, to try and associate it with something positive and something universal as well. I think, we've got far too much authoritarianism and top-down politics in the world. We want to really start listening to ordinary people at the grassroots and get a sense of what they feel and what they think.
Well, if we can get stuck into your political beliefs, Mike, I read your manifesto, actually. You kindly sent us a copy here at IDC, and I've been looking over it over the past few days. And I have to say, it's very well written, and I thought it was quite a good summary of recent political history in Britain. I thought it was very well explained. And you believe, Mike, that the British parliamentary system does not work in the interests of the general public, and that the apparatus of the state is too cumbersome and expensive, and it needs to change. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, I think we're living on sort of the remnants of yesterday's sort of feast. Really, we were a very successful country in the 18th century. We were very successful in creating a kind of culture around the world that spread the rule of law, which gave the various countries that we occupied or influenced a civil service, maybe some railways and things. We were successful then. We're not successful now. We have to sort of realize that we've got a limited but important role in the world. But in terms of managing our own internal affairs, we need to stop sort of thinking it's still the late 18th and early 19th century. We can afford to have huge parliament. We can afford to have expensive sort of political structures. We can afford to have a party political system that really is supposed to represent ordinary working people, but actually represents various types of vested interest.
Yeah. Well, I often liken Britain to a freight train, which is it was very good at doing its job once upon a time, but now it's very much in motion. It's been in motion for centuries, and it's so big and cumbersome. It's no longer able to maneuver in the modern world. That's how I see Britain. It's like a big, old, heavy a freight train, and it's very difficult once a country has been successful and it has very ancient institutions for it to take a different course. And I suppose that's a challenge that our country faces now. You are critical, Mike, of the neoliberal ideology, which has been, I suppose, the prevailing orthodoxy in the developed world since the Reagan and Thatcher eras. Could you please elaborate on that a bit?
Well, yeah, I think capitalism as a political and economic orthodoxy, it always goes into various periods of crisis, and it was doing that way back in the 18th and the 19th centuries, right way through to the 20th century. The line on the graph, is very much sort of going down, and I think by the 1970s, it was becoming obvious that the reliance on this economic anarchy, this capitalism, this capitalist model wasn't going to continue to deliver for the West in the longer term. So people started to look around for sort of ways of modifying it or reforming it, if you like. And they hit on the idea back in the 70s and the 80s that somehow it was the state that was the problem, and that what we needed to do was get the state off people's backs, get the state out of people's lives.
Smash the state, as Rick from the Young Ones used to say. Rick and Neil from the Young Ones used to always say, "Smash the state," I think, didn't they?
Well, I mean, in a way, that was that element of anarchy. I mean, I kind of accept I like the idea of sort of a certain level of anarchy. Where a little chaos is a good thing. We all muddle around, we share our ideas, we mix it up a bit, and we see what comes out at the end. I mean, I like that. Unfortunately, with this particular attempt at moderating or reforming capitalism, all the emphasis was placed on releasing the power of the market and letting the power of the markets kind of control huge chunks of the world's economy. And that's really started to fail by around about the early part of the 21st century, around about the banking crisis, if you like. But it's left a terrible legacy of relationship beyond the economy being founded on the basis of greed and transactionality. And if anything sums up what I call secular Westernism, because we're not a Christian West, we don't really have any real religious affiliations in the West anymore. We might pretend we've got a Christian heritage, if you like, but what I call secular Westernism is this secularized world that the markets have created, which is essentially transactional and greed based.
I think you likened in your manifesto the neoliberal prevailing orthodoxy to a religion. And I think if it is like a religion, then its false goddess is perhaps Margaret Thatcher. But I was watching a video clip earlier on today, actually, Mike, of Margaret Thatcher. And as I'm sure you're aware, she's pretty unpopular in the Northeast because of the decline in heavy industry, or the destruction of heavy industry and Thatcher's war against the miners, etc. But I watched a video of her today, and she was talking about when she was ousted, the messy end of her career, and she had tears in her eyes and she started crying. And I was thinking, say what you want about Margaret Thatcher, and I'm not a fan, but at least she did actually seem to care about her mission and what she was doing. If you look at the political class today, I mean, does Rishi Sunak and Theresa May and these, do they even like give a toss? I mean, really, I don't know. It seems at least she wasn't a robot. At least she seemed to be she might have been a monster, but she was she wasn't just a machine. I suppose that's what I'm getting at. But what I want to speak about now, Mike, if you don't mind, is your manifesto. On page 4 of your manifesto, you emphasize the importance of collaboration, consensus, and cooperation. And as you know, Mike, I assume you know, the organization I'm part of, we're an Islamic organization. We're called IDC, Islamic Diversity Center. We believe in the Quran and Sunnah. That's our dustur, our manifesto, for want of a better way of putting it, our constitution. And the Quran says, وَتَعَوَنُوا عَلَى الْبِرِّ وَالتَّقْوَى وَلَا تَتَعَوَنُوا عَلَى الْإِثْمِ وَالْعُدْوَانِ. Cooperate in good and God consciousness, and do not cooperate in sin and transgression. I think this idea of cooperation is very important, Mike, and it's obviously something you've thought about. If you don't mind elaborating on what that means to you, the idea of ta'awun, as it's called in Arabic, of cooperation and consensus, the 3 C's that I read in your manifesto.
Well, I think we have to broadly accept that we all come to the world with different positions, different perspectives on things. And for humanity to flourish and for humanity to thrive, we have to, as I said earlier on, when we were talking a little bit about the anarchy of the free market, I think, we have to have the ability to talk, to exchange views, not to be dogmatic, not to be too sort of fixated on doing things in a prescribed way, but to be sort of open to new ideas. And so for me, the three C's are very much about sort of a liberal approach to ideas, a liberal approach to society, allowing all sorts of different perspectives and positions that to be accepted and adopted. And let's just see, I mean, there is a bit of God. My belief is there's a little bit of God in all of us. There is not one statement that, for me, states that this is what God believes. God believes the things that come out of all the various, multifarious interactions of all the people on the planet. So ensuring that that is allowed to continue seems to me to be the way that we advance the cause of humanity. Restricting that becomes incredibly problematic.
You seem to be quite skeptical about identity politics, which of course is a hot topic these days. Modern eating habits, I think that's pretty uncontroversial. Aspects of feminism and modern dating culture. So all hot topics there. Could you please elaborate on that a bit?
I mean, if we just sort of wrap it all up and call it sort of, wokery, if you like. I mean, that's the whole debate about wokery has been going on for about the last 10 years, I suppose. And people don't really understand what it is, what wokery is, what it comes from, where it has its origins. It fundamentally has its origins in postmodernism. The idea that there's no absolute truths and things like that. That a lot of things that we think we understand are just social constructions created for us by our societies. And a good way of looking at that would be, for example, the concept of marriage. We think we understand what marriage is, but actually, if you look around the world, marriage can be many different things in many different contexts and many different cultures. So it tends to the postmodernists were actually onto something. They were sort of saying, "Well, what does it mean to be a woman?" Well, you can define a woman in a way which most people in any particular culture would identify as being accurate. But then you go somewhere else and you apply the same standard, and you find that actually there's a lot of inaccuracy about the description of what constitutes a woman in these various cultures. Unfortunately, that whole idea of some concept being created socially got sort of twisted out of shape, really, and it came to be used to justify all kinds of things which were good for the free market, but actually made no sense to the vast majority of ordinary people.
Yeah.
The free market with its transactional relationships and its fundamental principles of greed and self-interest um, promoted these ideas that there were all these identity differences between us all. We're all just various different identities competing with each other. We all had different pockets of disposable income. You hear about the grey pound, the pink pound, and all this sort of thing. So it made perfect sense within the context of a free market to push all these ideas, and push them they did. And so these principles, as I say, self-interest, greed, transactional relationships, have now created a kind of a world in which people have lost sight of the things that really matter, the fundamental issues that unite us as humanity, and they now sort of focus on all the things that are a bit of a preoccupation for the neoliberal free market.
Sticking with this concept, I just want to ask you, what do you think of the theory, the conspiracy theory, if you like, that wokery, for want of a better way of putting it, it is a, a means to divide and rule the populace. If you get people obsessed with things like microaggressions and all these different isms, they won't focus on on the greater crimes that are being done against us as a society or against the world. Do you think there is an element of divide and rule in the woke movement?
Yeah, I think I'd look at it from a sort of, from maybe the other end of the telescope. Really, I mean, I think that yeah, there's definitely, it's not conspiracy theory. You know, at the end of the day, if you're interested in preserving, let's call it the neoliberal free market, if your commitment is to ensuring the survival of that, because you know you get rich, some people get rich from that free market. Corporations can make profits. Profits make pensions. You know, profits also pay for taxation and all this sort of thing. You know, we're all kind of, we've all been forced to buy into this idea. So it's not a conspiracy. I mean, it's actually the way the system operates. It's the way capitalism has always operated. It's always sought out a profit, you know, wherever it can find it. And if it's not controlled by government, you know, it would make a profit out of selling illegal drugs to children. I mean, that's the nature of the system. That's how it works. Governments come along and say, well, actually, you can't put kids up chimneys because it's cheaper than, you know, doing it in any other way. We're going to put a stop to that. We're going to put a stop to this issue, this activity that you like to do to maximize your profits. So slowly over time, capitalism got restrained. So it's not a conspiracy theory that this sort of stuff goes on, but it is true, absolutely, as you say, that when you start to divide us up into identity groups and you move away from class as the main determinant of social failure or success, you do actually sort of neutralize any risk to that system.
Don't you think that even the language of class is antiquated now, Mike? I mean, to speak of even a working class in a modern Britain, which has virtually no coal mining, shipbuilding, glass making, virtually all of the heavy industry is gone. It's totally absent from Britain now, most of it. Isn't it, speaking in terms of class, a bit of an anachronism nowadays?
Well, no, because I think if you've obviously read, you know, my booklet, The Economy, Society and the State, quite thoroughly. And what I basically said in that is that when we stopped having that traditional employed working class, we actually sort of created a new consumer class. And that new consumer class is the new working class. But rather than have that new consumer class having a class identity where they all might turn around and say, well, hang on a minute, this is outrageous. Look at the way we're being treated. Look at how we're being spoon-fed sort of little bit of money by the state to keep the whole free market system operating. We're all divided up into our various identity groups, where we're then sort of expected to start squabbling amongst ourselves. So, and it works. I mean, you know, you've only got to look at what happens with, you know, the various identity groups they've manufactured. You know, it really does feel like the theology of the free market has come up with the doctrine of wokery.
Mm-hmm. Well, I want to come back to your booklet. I keep calling it a manifesto. I hope that's not. I hope you don't mind me calling it that. Would you prefer to call it a booklet?
It's yeah. It's not. I mean, it's not a manifesto. I mean, all the stuff I write, if you like, and I've written 6 booklets. They're all big. They're all to some extent a manifesto of what I think. The Blue Revolution itself doesn't necessarily agree with all the things I write about. As I say, it's just a political crash. Somebody else will come along and write something completely different on the Blue Revolution.
Got it.
But yeah, that's no
Okay. Well, what I read in your booklet, Mike, it alerted me to the fact that you are very much aware of the problem of debt. Do you know, Mike, that interest-based finance or usury is completely prohibited in Islam? Did you know that?
I didn't know that.
Yeah, yeah, and I mean, to me, that's one of the USPs, the unique selling points of Islam as a holistic way of life. I think personally, the entire concept of interest-based financial transactions is totally pernicious and corrosive, and it's behind a lot of the trouble in the world today. I don't know if you're a particularly nationalistic or patriotic person, but uh, as far as I understand, interest-based finance brought down the British Empire. So if you believe the British Empire was a good thing, well, interest-based finance, I believe, put an end to that. And I think it's going to do the same thing with America. I think one day America is just going to drown under its debt. It's it's totally unhealthy, and I think the world will be a lot better if we done away with it. So interest.
I've only just comment on usury in general, and the religious reasons why it has been used, and it really ought not to be used. And if you go back to our very primitive tribal period in our evolution, the idea of borrowing with interest would have been the equivalent of saying to a particular group, well, we'll lend you half an antelope, but you pay us back because you haven't got any food, but you pay us back, 2 antelopes next week. It makes no sense. It's completely inhuman, the concept that you would take more from something than they were capable of producing for themselves. So you can see, sort of in historical terms, why usury or borrowing with interest is so problematic, because it means you've got to basically get more to pay back not only what you borrowed, but the interest on top of that. And if that's simple products or produce, it creates problems as well as it does if it's basically money. But then you can see how around about the period of the sort of 15th, 16th, 17th century, the world was evolving in the West. And it was possible for one individual to actually, because of the growth in the money system, it was possible for somebody to actually not only borrow a figure, but also to somehow create more money to enable not only that figure to be repaid, but the interest on top as well. And as a result of that process, the economy grew. So from the sort of 12th, 13th century, all the way through until about the middle of the 20th century, we saw growth in the economy based on this money lending system, because it enabled value to be created. Just call it value. We could create value as a result of borrowing and lending. There came a point, though, where that stopped, and really, that period is around about the time I talk about in that publication you've got there. There came a point in the 70s when that ability to borrow and to create value and to pay back not only the capital figure but also the interest stopped. But what's happened is that because we've got so used to this idea that borrowing and paying interest is a normal part of Western culture, we can't seem to step off this particular treadmill. And we're now doing it not with value being created, in other words, good things being created that humanity can make use of. Yeah, we're doing it now just to create more money. So it becomes a system which is essentially about creating wealth. And that wealth that's created has no value, but it still manages to flow into the hands of the pockets of a handful of very wealthy people. Though it's become significantly more immoral as a result of the context within which we're now operating it.
But it's dressed up as being so nice, like if you watch adverts for banks, you'd think you were watching adverts for Save the Children or something. Sometimes, they present themselves as do-gooders, but they're not do-gooders. They are a very pernicious and corrosive force in society, in my
They
opinion.
are more so now than ever. Yeah, more so now than ever. I mean, there was a time when it worked, but I don't think that period is now.
Okay. Getting back to your manifesto, Mike, you write on page 10, and I think this is where you get a bit heated in your writing. You write, people got fat, tattooed and pierced, ill and unemployable, but with the government maintaining demand for mass goods and services via welfare and state employment, who was going to complain? I think, Mike, that the only thing that can revive the spirit of the British people is Islam. That's what I believe. I mean, feel free to disagree, of course, but that's what I believe. I think Islam is the only worldview, the only way of life which really has the power to revive human hearts and also human societies. But I'll let you make your own decision, of course. But if you can just elaborate a bit on that statement, Mike, it seems a bit, if you forgive me, a little bit misanthropic. I mean, what did you write that after getting exasperated in a high street one day when you saw how ill-mannered people have become? I got a lot of Peter Hitchens vibes from that statement.
Well, I just think it makes the point that if you stop creating, if you sort of if your society stops being a society that produces, and yet you still need to have consumption.
Yeah.
And you find various ways of ensuring what people can consume. And the markets, of course, will always fill a void. If there's a void there to be filled and they can legitimately fill it, they will. And so all I was basically saying there was the free market came along and it recognized that tattoos, piercing, feeding people terrible food that makes them grossly overweight because it's full of sugars, which are sugar's almost like a drug. They stopped us smoking and then they weaned us onto sugar. So the point I wasn't making a personal point about individuals. I was making a general point about the way the free market economy has tapped into certain markets and massively exploited them at the cost of people's health and welfare.
You also are a bit skeptical about the minimum wage, which I think is a very good idea. I mean, Tony Blair, he done a lot of bad things, but I think he done a few good things, and one of them was introduce the minimum wage. What you got against the minimum wage, Mike?
Well, I think the minimum wage would be fine, I suppose, if you didn't have open borders and you didn't have a tendency for the supply of labour to drive wage levels down to that minimum. The problem is that minimum wages work in certain situations, and a bit like interest rates. Interest rates are not in and of themselves a bad thing. It depends on the context, and it's the same with the minimum wage. It depends on the context in which you operate the minimum wage. What's happened in this country over the last, say, 30 or 40 years is that the vast majority of wages have been driven down to the minimum. A vast number of people find themselves working on 0-hour contracts and have their income topped up by a government, by tax credits and universal credit and things. And it keeps them in a state of dependence on the state. They're in a complete dependence on the state. In the old days, the level of the wages was determined much more by the market. Now, I left school in 1978, and my first job was working in a local fun fair in a holiday resort in Norfolk, and I was paid 50p an hour. And I remember one particular week, the height of the season, the apex of the season, the boss came along and said, "I want everyone to work a 100-hour week." So we were literally working, every hour God sent us, really. And I made £100. It'd be £50.
Yeah.
And it was like staggering, earning that sort of money, but putting that sort of effort in. And to me, it didn't seem to be particularly problematic in local factories in the food sector around here in Lincolnshire. There were people earning £600 or £700 a week 20 years ago because they were really good at cutting the high value crops that the supermarkets needed. So calabrese, cauliflower. If you were good, you'd get up early in the morning, you'd start harvesting at about 5 o'clock, you'd be finished by 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and you'd made yourself hundreds of pounds. And I was a civil servant at the time, and some of the people doing this work were earning more than I was, and I was considered to be on a reasonably good civil service wage. So all the minimum wage seems to me to have done is drive wage levels down for ordinary working people. It might have seemed like a good idea, but a lot of what Tony Blair did, I think, was sort of there was a sort of there was a subtext to it. Should we put it that way?
Okay.
So there's a context. Let's drive up wages and make everyone better off. But the subtext was actually within a supply side model for labour, it'll actually drive wage levels down.
That's very interesting, and to be honest, it's something I'd never considered. I did see the minimum wage as an unambiguously good thing, but I suppose it's almost like the capitalist system has found a way to even turn that septic and turn something which sounds good on paper or looks good on paper into something not good.
So another issue is that there are some people in the economy who find it quite difficult to gain employment.
Yeah.
And if you didn't have a minimum wage, an employer might say, "Well, look, I'll give them a go. I can't justify paying them, X amount, but I'll pay them a lower wage and see how we get on." So actually, I think it's also had the effect of taking huge numbers of people who may have found themselves a role within the economy out of being economically active. And that's not a wage-related issue. It's more of a sort of sociological issue.
Forgive me, Mike, but you see, it's taken them out of economic activity. Somebody might say it's protected them from economic exploitation, because for somebody to pay somebody £2 an hour is wrong, I think. And I'll take on board what you say, but I think on balance, personally, and I'm not an economist, but I do think overall the minimum wage is a good idea, and if it's being misused, if it's not achieving the goals that it should achieve, can be tinkered with perhaps, but I'm still pro that policy, I think. So anyway, Mike, getting back to your manifesto, on the final page of your manifesto, you mentioned the decline of Christianity. You touched upon your philosophical or spiritual beliefs a bit earlier, but do you consider yourself a Christian, if you don't mind me asking?
No, I have a Christian heritage, because Britain was a Christian country. I don't think Britain can really class itself as a Christian country now. It still has that Christian heritage. I would like to see the disestablishment of the Church of England. I don't think we should have an established church in this country. I don't think we should have an established religion in this country. I think when you start to get established religions, you lose the dynamism, and the contract choice consent principles tend to break down, because the expectation is that everyone follows the one belief system. So I tend to think that religions are a little bit like fingers pointing at the moon. They're not the moon. They're just fingers pointing at the moon. They're not the moon itself. So my beliefs are informed by Christianity, I suppose. But I wouldn't class myself as a Christian. Having said that, I do believe in God. I'd call myself an agnostic theist, a bit like the doctrine of Tawheed in Islam. I do think there is a force out there, but I do honestly believe that force is unknowable. It has no character. It has no form. And I rather like that idea that is captured in some Islamic theology, that God is just completely unknowable, which is why I think it's quite challenging to then look at the Quran and say, well, this is what God thinks. I'm not sure that duality works for me, really.
That's an interesting point, and an interesting conundrum, Mike. And I don't know how interested in religion and spirituality you are, but I do want to stick with this for a little bit, if you don't mind. I would say that there are different types of knowledge, and God certainly can't be dissected in a petri dish like a slug, but God can be known on the level of the human heart, and it is by reading His word, the Quran. We believe it to be the literal word of God, of course, and trying to manifest it in one's life, that one can have what's called mushahada, witnessing of the heart. And it's really difficult or impossible to describe in human language. It's more something that's experiential. But we have in Islam the Sharia, that is the do's and don'ts of the religion. But when the war on terror started 20 years ago, Sharia was almost a swear word. But if I had to describe it in layman's terms, the Sharia is basically the do's and don'ts of the religion. And if somebody sees them as parameters in their life, and they try to adhere to those guidelines, they will live a very upright life, a life which is good for physical and mental health. And if they sincerely try to do the acts of what's called ibadah, of worship of Islam, reading the Quran, praying 5 times a day, they will come to know God at a level which is quite mysterious and difficult to describe. And I think it's something. I became a Muslim over 20 years ago, Mike, when I was a very young man, and it was the best decision I've ever made. But I asked you if you were a Christian because I wanted to ask you, and I'm guessing the answer is yes, if you know that there are many similarities and many shared beliefs between Islam and Christianity. Did you know, for example, that we Muslims believe in Jesus Christ?
I do know that, yeah.
Yeah.
I do know a little bit about Islam. I don't know a lot. I wouldn't claim to be an Islamic scholar.
Yeah.
I would say that I would say there are some challenges, with Islam, in the sense that it is very kind of rigid.
Simplistic and brutal, I think you were the words used in your booklet.
I think it is, and that's a strength, maybe. In some respects, that's a strength, because it clears away all the clutter and all the nonsense. As I say, I look at all religions in effect with a fairly critical eye. I mean, to me, a religion is an ideology. It has its origins in various periods in history. But in terms of Islam specifically, it is a very very simple. It's very simple in its requirements. It's very clear what it requires you to do. It lays down very clear principles that you must do this and you mustn't do that, and it also establishes what the likely outcomes are going to be in terms of Sharia justice if you do infringe any of the requirements of the faith. So it is quite contrasted with a more modern liberal view. It does come across as slightly more sinful, slightly more brutal. But then that could, in a sense, be a strength because the Western world has created so much kind of froth that people just can't make head or tail of what it is to actually be a human anymore. There are there's so many pressures to achieve this and pressures to achieve that. There's pressures on people pressures on women to go to work, pressures on women to stay at home, pressures on women to have children, pressures on women not to have children, pressures on men to be, to be responsible, to be irresponsible. You can't make head or tail of all of this.
Yeah. And it changes every 5 minutes.
Yeah, and I think that's the transactional nature of the free market. It wants to create this sense of chaos, so that it's constantly selling new products, constantly selling new opportunities, selling new outlooks. But as a sort of a right-wing Marxist, I guess my view would be this: that there is such a thing as species essence. There is something that makes us human. There are certain characteristics that we all share there, irrespective of our faith. So you were talking about the feeling that you get when you're able to sort of to pray and you feel that you're connecting, if you like, with God or connecting with the universe. That's not an unusual thing for people to experience. I've experienced that, when your body and your mind sort of phenomenologically fuse together, during a period of worship or some sort of performative action. It does feel like you're getting in touch with something far greater than who you are yourself. So I do think, the transactional greed and self-interested character of the free market is taking us away from our fundamental human essence. And religion is one way of kind of getting back to that.
Everything sacred will turn to vapor. Isn't that a quote of Marx, or is that an anachronistic one?
Yeah, you've read that in one of my booklets, and yes, I mean basically what Marx was saying there is that the capitalist system's ability to devour everything eventually it ends up with you staring at each other with nothing. And at that point, when you literally had everything you believed in gobbled up by the money system, we will realize that we're humans and we owe each other such a lot. We can only work together collaboratively, cooperatively, and with consent. And when we get to that point, that is when, if you like, the world is well, what's the word I'm looking for? It's sort of
The singularity. I think people will call it the singularity now.
well, you sort of acquire and I very much believe in that. I very much believe that the world needs to have a kind of a single ideology that recognizes that our fundamental, the fundamental nature of our humanity. We owe each other things, and what we don't need is to have those relationships that we can have with each other as human beings interfered with by values which are alien to us as a species. And if we're fighting and undermining and exploiting and discriminating, then we're not doing what, in my opinion, would be in the interests of us as a species, and maybe reflects something of the mind of God, if you like.
I just want to add on to those points and respond to some of them, if you don't mind, Mike. First of all, you did mention it in your manifesto, the phenomenon of OnlyFans, and it strikes me that even relationships like between the genders are becoming commercialized. I mean, that's like almost like the ultimate victory of capitalism, if that's not too much of a pretentious thing to say. But also, Mike, getting back to the simplicity of Islam, I agree that Islam is quite simple and in some ways rigid. But I think sometimes simplicity is a beautiful thing. And in a world where everything does seem to be in flux, and we're being bombarded with new concepts every day. And I think it's going to get more and more extreme as technology advances. I think Islam does provide a solid ground on which to have a firm footing in one's life. And also, I do believe, Mike, very much in tough love. I think the rules, they're quite difficult to swallow aspects of Islam. I see that as tough love. I think that God, or Allah, our Creator, He knows what's best for us, and He's legislated for us a way of life which has some rules. It's not always easy to follow, but it's for our own benefit. Similar to how a doctor might, prescribe a course of medicine which tastes bad, but ultimately cures the sick patient. And finally, Mike, you said just now, I think you called yourself a right-wing Marxist, and also in your manifesto, it's clear that I don't think you could be, or your worldview could be clearly designated as right-wing or left-wing. It seems to be somewhere in the middle. And of course, Islam does describe itself as a sirat al-mustaqim, and true Muslims, are the ummatan wasata, the middle path, the middle nation. Islam very much emphasizes the importance of moderation and balance. So I think that's something you might like to ruminate upon. Mike, is there anything you want to add? And also, please do tell the viewers where they can find out about your work and read more about your Weltanschauung, your worldview. Please go ahead, Mike.
No, it's been a very interesting conversation. I think we should have more of these conversations. I think that, religions, all the world's religions, as I say, are fingers pointing at the moon. They're not the moon itself, but we need to gain a sense of where religions and ideologies like my ideology, actually share things in common. I mean, as you sort of mentioned, simplicity. Simplicity shouldn't involve a lack of progress. We need to see society progress, technology to progress. We need to make the world a better place for all of us. And we need to talk and converse and understand and accept as part of that process. So the more events like this and the more people that engage in the sort of conversations that we've been having this afternoon, as far as I'm concerned, the better. The more open we can be to different ideas. If anyone is interested in Blue Revolution, and bear in mind the Blue Revolution is simply a brand. When you go on there and you look at the stuff that I've written, it's me that's saying that. It's not Blue Revolution that's saying it. They can go and find a bit more stuff at www.abluerevolution.org. So there's an A before the Blue Revolution, and the reason for that is that there was already a Blue Revolution in 2017 when I set it up, and I had to do something to distinguish our website address from the other pre-existing one.
Got it. That is received loud and clear, Mike. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us today, all the way from Lincolnshire. But Mike, thank you so much. God bless you. And if you read the booklet that we sent you, I'd appreciate it. If you have any questions or comments about Islam, you've got our contact details. Please don't hesitate to get in touch. God bless you, Mike. Thank you for taking the time to speak to us today. Cheers. Ladies and gentlemen, you've been watching World in Motion. I hope you've enjoyed that fascinating conversation with Mike, a fascinating guy with some really interesting opinions. Do watch the next episode. It's going to be fantastic, inshallah. May Allah bless you all. May Allah bless me. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.